but in essence, they're put back on their feet again, and that's what we really need to continue to do. And one of the big sources of trafficking has been the internet and these websites that do the shameless advertising under the guise of free speech. They've never been liable. They've never been held accountable. And so the good news is we've passed new legislation now that holds these websites liable for their actions. And so websites like Backpage.com, for instance, now have literally been shut down by federal law enforcement and by the government. And so that's where 70% of all trafficking comes from, is through these websites. And so we're going to make a dent in this. We're going after it, and it's going to make a big difference in improving and saving people's lives, by the way. One of the most gratifying issues I've had a chance to work on. And I have to mention, too, this issue of our Liberian refugees that are in our community. You know, Minnesota is one of those states where we're basically in the top in the country for our population in the Liberian community. Many of who came here decades ago in a brutal civil war. You know, they've had the Ebola crisis, and every president, going back to George Bush and President Obama, and now even President Trump, have done extensions to making sure that these folks can stay here. Many of them have built small businesses. They have families here. This is their country for all practical purposes now, and I want to make sure we're working on a permanent solution so we don't have to continually go through this annual or biannual renewal to renew that status. But good news is, thanks to myself and other members of the Minnesota delegation, we were able to lead an effort to make sure that our Liberian community was going to be safe and have a little bit more certainty going into next year again, and we'll continue to working on a permanent solution. But with that, there's a lot more left to talk about. I'm also going to ask you a question tonight, and so you'll have a chance just to hit a button on your telephone to a quick, brief survey, a yes, no, and undecided, just to get a snapshot for you guys, for you folks. But let's just start rolling through the questions, and thanks for taking the time to join. And I think we've got Tom on the line from Brooklyn Park. Thanks for waiting.
Hello?
Hello?
I had a question about the tax cut and why you supported
Sure.
the tax cut to put us into debt by $1.5 trillion and give most of the money to the top 1%, and banks have already gotten $3 billion from the tax cut. I mean, that seemed like a really crazy thing to do that wasn't needed for an economy that's already kind of chugging along fine. So, about that.
Yeah. Well, thanks for asking. Actually, the tax cuts themselves were actually more geared towards lower and middle income folks. In fact, all the numbers and statistics show that a larger percentage of taxes now will be paid higher by those who are millionaires, I guess. So they're going to be paying a little bit more, as an overall percentage. The average tax cut, I think, for an average medium income was somewhere around $2,000 some for a family of four. Might be a little bit higher in our neck of the woods in the suburbs in Minnesota, but it's all dependent on your individual situation. And look, for me, it's not just the tax cut that any individual might see, because we've had hundreds of companies deliver special bonuses, pay raises and all that sort of stuff, and new benefits to their employees. But it's really about making sure our economy is set to boom again, because for the last 8 years in particular, for the first time in the history of the country, we had wages decline in an economic recovery. That has never happened before. And so you had record numbers of people living at home with their parents, young people in particular, couldn't afford housing. You have record numbers of people working part-time that want to work full-time. And so by getting the corporate rate down and helping small business, you got more people working, you got more people being hired, and people are climbing the economic ladder again. You mentioned some of the banks and others that are taking the benefits or seeing the benefits of some of the reforms. That's true, but I will also tell you that now, with reform in place, many of those banks now have to take chargebacks in the next quarter, and so they won't have that impact. And I think the most profound impact on the tax reform is actually going to be saving our jobs in our headquarters, because we have too many of our companies that have left Minnesota, that have left the United States. They've gone to Ireland, they've gone to other low-tax jurisdictions. And when they do that, you lose the manufacturing, you lose the jobs, you lose the innovation, and that all goes with the headquarters. And now, for the first time, we're actually seeing companies reverse their decisions and come back, which is very, very important, I think. So, great question. And thanks for the feedback. All right, we got Mark on the line from Brooklyn Park. Thanks for waiting. Hello? Hey, Mark, how are you?
I'm good. So I just heard about the tax breaks. I actually work for Wells Fargo, one of the big recipients of that plan. As far as wages, things like that, really didn't get any kind of additional benefits as a result of this. Kind of what I'm seeing from the news with corporations, there's little pittances that they're giving out here and there, $1,000 bonus, which are not permanent. But a lot of it seems like they're using it for stock buybacks. That really benefits wealthy people who are invested in maybe 401k plans, but that's not the majority of Americans. A lot of people don't have investments. And so how is this tax plan that really benefits corporations when it's largely being used for buybacks, how is that supposed to help me?
Yeah. Well, good question.
And one other thing.
Yeah.
It's very easy to give that money away, but now, you were saying earlier, we have to worry about paying for it. I think that we should have worried about paying for it before we gave the money away.
Yeah. Well, and this goes back to, again, in terms of paying for it, it's like when you're losing headquarters, losing jobs, losing manufacturing, that's obviously a big problem long term, which is one of the reasons why growth is so stagnant, so sluggish, and now we've got, the economy's in a really good state. Again, workers' real take-home pay is up 3.4%. Again, first time that's happened in, I think, a decade and a half. Unemployment at the lowest rate since 2018 years, which is good news. Now, on the stock buyback side, yes, it's true that not everyone benefits from a stock buyback, for instance, right? Now, you may benefit at Wells Fargo because you might have 401k, right? And so, stock companies buy back their stock, it increases the value of their stock, and you as a 401k or someone who works there, you're going to get that benefit of it. So I think there's 37% of folks have retirement accounts that are in that category. But in general, stock buybacks are good for working Americans. And that's because, again, you got over half of all American households own some type of stock. And what happens is stock buybacks increase values. It helps all that dollars as they come in. It gets transferred out into other investments and other companies. And so you have new startups, you have new companies starting. And that's also a change from what we've seen in the last 8 years in particular, because we had more companies that were failing than were starting. And our economy is built not around the Wells Fargo. I have anything against Wells Fargo, but it is the new small business community, right? It's the startup community, and we had seen that just decline precipitously. And one of the best testifiers we had that came out to Washington recently was from Rogers, Minnesota. Actually lives in Maple Grove, but his company's in Rogers. Small business guy at CTI, and a small business, and he testified. Now, the Democrats and Republicans said he was the greatest witness, because he basically said, look, before the tax reform, I could only put 35 cents of every dollar back into the company. I was losing everything else in tax. Now he says it's completely reversed, and it's like rocket fuel, because I'm hiring new people. I gave everybody a bonus. I gave everyone a pay raise as well, and I'm hiring more people, and now I'm going to bring my manufacturing back from overseas, which is good. This is a family-owned small business. It started in very humble beginnings in the house. That's the type of, I think, energy we need to see. And again, you talk about the spending side. You got to focus on the other side of the ledger with revenues increasing now, because debt and deficits are really important or critical in terms of those of us that believe we should pay attention to that. But that was on a bad trajectory, before the tax reform. Now, at least, we have a fighting chance to kind of get things back on track in terms of the broader economy overall. But great points. Okay, we're going to keep rolling. I think we've got Walt on the line, also from Brooklyn Park. Thanks for waiting.
Hi. Yes. What I'd like to know is regarding the conceal and carry that is reciprocal amongst all the states, so that if I carry my gun from here to New York, I don't get pulled over by the police in New York and charged with a felony. Okay? What's happening with that bill? And then also I'd like to talk about training the teachers to actually protect our kids in school so that we don't have any mass shootings.
Okay. And I'm just curious. Do you think the training is a good idea? I'm just curious. So,
the training of the teachers?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I think that all teachers, should be subject to a whether or not they take a course in guns, but just on self-defense and defense and how to unarm a person with a gun and what to do. I mean, hiding in a corner doesn't help, okay?
Yeah.
I mean, you have to be proactive in a situation. So if you've taken any courses, whether it's in training, but in self-defense, there's two different subjects here: self-defense as well as the training on how to discharge a firearm correctly.
Sure. Well, Walt, thanks. Well, Walt, I mean, and let me just start. First of all, the concealed carry legislation. I mean, look, Minnesota has concealed carry. Lots of other states. In fact, I think 49 out of the 50 may have it. I'm trying to remember what the number is. And the law varies a little bit state to state. So the concealed carry reciprocity issue that you mentioned, that would treat your permit the same if you were in Minnesota and went to Iowa, for instance, that passed in the House. Now, it has not been acted on in the Senate, so I don't know what its prospects are, if there's a timeline where something may happen on that. But it is important to remember also that if someone was coming from another state, they would still have to comply with all of the Minnesota components of the law we have, for instance, like the posting of the signs, things like that. So they have to follow Minnesota law where you can and can't and cannot use a weapon. So, if the law is different than Texas, you got to follow the Minnesota law. And that's the version that did pass in the House, but has not had action in the Senate. In terms of training teachers, I mean, look, I don't think that's an answer in terms of addressing gun violence that's out there. My wife's a school teacher, and as a parent, I think it's imperative that schools are safe and you got a good environment where students can learn. That's really critical. I don't think we should rely on teachers to be the folks that are going to be responsible for safety in the classroom. But school districts can absolutely and should be able to make the individual decisions for whether they want to go through that process of arming teachers, or, as you mentioned, have training in certain areas for self-defense and disarming. I mean, that could be a component that I think a lot of the school violence dollars that were just actually passed into law a little over a month ago at the federal level, all these grants are now pushed down to the state and local level so that local school districts and states can apply or get those grant dollars and then use how they see is most important and fit. I also think, given the gaps in the current system, there are very strong common sense actions that some have already been passed into law, but there's more, I think, that can be done. The lifting of the ban on federal research on gun violence, that has been lifted formally now, so government can do basic research on that. Also, improvement of background checks. We had the individual, for instance, in Texas last fall, whose information was not disclosed as a part of the background system of domestic violence. And I think that information should be in the background check system, or that he was discharged from the Air Force. That should be in the background check system. That was fixed. And there are some other areas that we could probably fix in the background check system just to have some more common perspectives and address gun violence. I think that's very, very important. Again, if you want to ask a question, dial *3 on your telephone, and that'll get you into the queue. And then I'll have a chance to ask you guys a question as well in a little bit. Okay, we've got...
The Access Live event operator has been notified that you wish to ask a question.
Park callers tonight.
Hi there, my name is Caleb. I'm a centrist kind of Republican from the area. Question for you about kind of bipartisan legislation. It's my understanding that today is the most divisive time in American politics since the Civil War. And as someone who has values both on the liberal side and the Democratic side and the Republican side, I'm curious about your bipartisan connections and what it looks like to sort of partner with the other side in terms of bipartisan legislation, what that looks like for the future, and what that looks like for the impetus behind not just having a polarized, super conservative Republicans and super liberal Democrats.
Well, if you could Caleb, to be honest, you kind of put your finger on the problem of Washington or getting stuff done, because it seems to me there's so much name calling, finger pointing, people that are not willing to work across the aisle. I'll just tell you right off the bat, my approach is very different. I think if you're going to be successful as a legislator, you need folks on both sides of the aisle to sign your bills. And I think that's how I've gotten the medical device tax repealed and suspended. That's how I've gotten the human trafficking bills done. And actually, out of all 435 members in the entire House, I'm number 3 for getting the most bipartisan support of legislation. And that's because if it's a good idea, I want Democrats to sign on. I want Republicans to sign on. The more, the better. And the pendulum's always got a swing of who's in charge. And again, if you want to be successful over time, you've got to build relationships and work across the aisle. Some of those initiatives I mentioned earlier on trafficking and Alzheimer's funding, for instance, are absolutely critical to getting things done across the aisle. And those are some good things we've done very positively. The other thing that I've done is join what's called we have a civility caucus. It's something that some of us are a part of, basically to send the message and to communicate not only to our constituents, of spending time together. And, look, if you spend time together, you're less likely to say something nasty about someone in debate or on the House floor. And I think that's very, very important. And is again, that just goes, maybe it's a little Minnesotan in the approach, but in the end, it's a model that has served me well, and I think, to be honest, would serve a lot of my colleagues well if they embrace that. Because a lot of my colleagues say, hey, I'm only going to sign on to a bill if it's only Republicans, or the Democrats will say the same thing. Well, guess what? That's how you end up with sort of a more partisan-charged environment. It makes it hard to do good policy in healthcare and other areas, for instance, on some of those areas if you're not working across the aisle, for instance. So that's just my approach, just to give you a little perspective. Okay, we're going to keep rolling. I think we've got Phil on the line from Edina. Thanks for waiting. Hey, Phil, are you still there?
Oh, Phil, yes. I'm here.
Hey.
Sorry. I guess my one about preventing guns into the wrong hands is the main thing, and I'm tired of a tax on the law-abiding citizens on the Second Amendment. And then my other one is on this border. Is there anything Congress can do to at least step up our efforts? I appreciate what Trump is trying to do on that. I'm all for legal immigration. I had a friend at work who spent $30,000 in over 3 years just to get his foreign-born wife and kid to immigrate, and it was kind of unsuccessful, even though he had been legal and stuff for many years. Anyway, and then let's see, I think the tax cut was a great idea, by the way. Unlike previous callers, our economy has been in such bad shape for 8 years that, and I'm retired, and my kids all went to the West Coast, so I'm spending a lot of time traveling, driving out there, and seeing other parts of the country, and I think Minnesota is doing rather well, and I support you, Eric, and I just hope to keep up the good work. The other thing, real quick, is if anything in Congress, I don't know if it's the Judiciary Committee or whatever, on this Mueller probe, that they would pull this thing to a head. If there's documents that Mueller and gang aren't producing, get on their case and wrap it up as far as this so-called collusion and get on it. It's gotten so political, it's crazy.
Yeah. Well, listen, Phil, thanks for mentioning that. It's interesting because some of the issues you mentioned kind of go into what the last caller called about, sort of the perception of partisanship. Actually, and the media, fuels that in terms of, you can't turn on any news channel without seeing, something. Maybe it might be about immigration, it might be about gun violence, it might be about the Russia or the Mueller probe, and you have someone on one side who's like for it, and then someone who's on the other side against it, and they're just talking at each other, constantly. They're not like trying to work through the issue to solve the issue in any respect, which is probably frustrating for a lot of folks. Well, we kind of talked a little bit about the gun violence side, but I should mention on border security, I'm all for securing the border. I'm not for putting like a wall up, across the national park and Big Bend National Park, et cetera. But I think the natural compromise is, sure, there'll be some more funding for border security. You know who's coming in. You've got a secure operation, and the border agents support that in exchange for making sure you got a legal immigration system that is a lot more efficient, that is working. You mentioned your friend spending $30,000 to go through all these hoops and not necessarily see results successfully, and that's frustrating. I mean, look, seeing the growth in the economy, now we've got a lot of jobs that need to be filled. That's the reality. There's like 6 million jobs that cannot be filled across the country, and I talked to a lot of small, medium, and large employers in Minnesota Minnesota all the time who talk about a skills gap, who need to hire folks, and by the way, are looking for people that don't just go to a 4-year college, but are trained in other apprenticeship programs or trades to making sure that they can really earn a really decent and good living. And immigration is a big part of that. And so if you get a working legal immigration with labor following capital, economy doing better, you should be able to fill those positions. That's the natural compromise, is to, make progress on DACA. These are, again, for all practical purposes, young people who have been in the United States all of their life. They know no other country. They speak no other language than English. And that's the easiest group to say, yeah, those folks should be here. They've earned that pathway, for being productive and legal status, et cetera. And yet the folks that say, hey, we got to have all of one thing or none of it, have blocked, I think, a lot of easy compromise solutions. And I don't think compromise should be a dirty word. And on the Mueller probe, my view is that the Mueller probe should finish out to its conclusion, and just be done. And the independent counsel should conclude. It's kind of frustrating to see all sort of like the side issues going on a long time. I know like one House committee, I think, has closed its investigation. I think the Senate investigation is still going. But those will all end up at some point, and I just assume they're going to end and be concluded, and that'll all be done. Okay, we're going to keep rolling. We got Matthew on the line from Bloomington. Thanks for waiting.
Hey, Erik. Thanks for doing this town hall. I personally wanted to thank you for the tax cuts. I wish that they were permanent. I'm hoping that something can be pushed through in the next couple of years here. But from a personal standpoint, being middle income, my wife and I, and a small business owner, it didn't help this year as much. My wife got one of the $1,000 bonuses from her work, and it's not a pittance. It helped pay off a couple of credit cards. But we're really looking forward to next year when it will really help my small business. That 20% deduction off the gross is after expenses is really going to help, and it might allow me to actually hire somebody to help me out with my business. So
yeah, no, that's good to hear. Thanks for the feedback. I appreciate that.
But but I wanted to get your take on being somebody who's a libertarian and who has concerns about civil liberties. What is your take on civil asset forfeiture? And I believe this is one of those subjects that can go, be a bipartisan issue and get both Republicans and Democrats.
Yeah, and real quick, can you give me your perspective on it? Because these issues go through Judiciary Committee, for instance, which I'm not on. I usually listen to law enforcement and a bunch of folks that have, a couple of views on it. But can you give me your perspective on that?
Well, it's pretty much taken due process and thrown it out the window.
Yeah.
A lot of folks that travel around with maybe $5,000-$10,000 of cash goes through the wrong county in the wrong state, gets pulled over. Maybe they're going to go buy a car or something, or pay for something in cash, and the police officer or whatever authority takes the money, and they never see it again. I know that there's been reports here in the city where the Hmong community and some other communities, they deal a lot in cash, and they've had issues with getting money back through civil asset forfeiture. And there's hundreds and hundreds of cases. I know the police officer side, of course, they want to catch the criminals, but at the same time, it's tangling. It's more money. It would cost more to get the money or get the property than actually trying to go, instead of just letting it go. So I think it's just taking due process and tossing it out the window. And as a constitutionalist, that's an erosion of our Constitution and the Fourth Amendment. And I just wanted to know your thoughts on it.
Yeah, good. Well, I'm an advocate for due process, and I think a big part of the situation you described is, getting more elected officials to hear some of the stories that are really happening out there, right? So if you have folks that may have confiscations, they're losing, cash because they go across the county line, state, whatever that may be, in a situation where you've got asset forfeiture and they're unable to get it back, you have to have a due process system in place. And I think one key that you mentioned at the outset of that question or point too was the bipartisan component of it. And I know that some of my colleagues, in particular on the Judiciary Committee, have spent time talking about some, and I don't know all the details, some ideas around addressing this issue bipartisanly, as well as the issue of criminal reform, other justice reform, for instance, where there's been bipartisan efforts. Giving people a second chance, et cetera, and there are some different solutions that are moving forward, I think, in committee. And they're probably separate that are being addressed in this category. And then finally, let me just mention, thanks for mentioning sort of the small business connection, because everyone gets a little bit lost in terms of what's reported for the tax overhaul that was done. It helped corporate rates go lower so we can compete around the world. But we didn't leave small business off the table. We gave that 20% deduction, as you mentioned, that you will use or will be able to now use to help hire new people. And there was one couple in Brooklyn Park that I talked to. They've been running a company themselves for about a year and a half, 2 years, working 100 hours a week, the two of them together, and now they can hire their very first employee. And that was really neat to hear. And so it sounds like you're in a similar situation where you're a small business, a Main Street company, and that's really where a lot of the economic growth and jobs come from, are from those companies, for instance. Okay, we're going to keep rolling. Thanks for your patience. Let me ask you a question, though, too, before we get into our next question. You just hit a button on your telephone real quick, but this goes back to our earlier conversation regarding the opioid epidemic and overdosing. So the question is very simple. You can hit a 1, a 2, or a 3 on your telephone. So the question for you is, do you support a limit on what a doctor can prescribe in opioids in being an answer to the opioid epidemic? So if you support limiting what a doctor can prescribe in pills to a lesser dose, hit 1 on your telephone for yes. Hit 2 if you don't think they should be restricted in what they can prescribe as your first prescription. Hit 2, and if you're unsure, hit 3, because sometimes you just don't have all the information. But the question is, because some have been talking about this now with the overprescriptions or the ease of prescriptions happening from physicians, do you believe there should be a limit of duration for how long a doctor can prescribe for opioids, for pain medication after surgery, after something else? If you think answer is yes, 1, yes, 2, no, and 3 if you're unsure. And it's just it's a policy issue that is being discussed or brought up as a possible solution that will come up.
Your response has been registered.
With questions, thanks. We've got Sam Ewell on the line from Brooklyn Park. Thanks for waiting.
Yeah, well, thank you, Congressman. This is from Milton. I'm from Liberia, immigrant from Liberia.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And also, I'm a member of the Ablao Association Soccer Club. And you play soccer with us sometimes. We really appreciate you being around. I know you come up. Have some busy schedule now. But anyway, before my question, just to get a little highlight about us, we are Liberian immigrants here. We are the closest ally to United States. We have DNA ties to America for the past almost 200 years. Immigrant slaves from here were sent back to Africa or they settled in Liberia, which of course just for the benefit of those of my fellow colleagues that are listening on the line. And even during the Cold War, we had the Omega Tower built in our country as the satellite program. I'm just giving this a little highlight to people to know which type of immigrant that lives among them in Brooklyn Park.
Yep.
Again, we had a civil war for over 14 years.
Yep.
Many people lost over 250,000 people displaced. In fact, since I've been here, I've been back in my country 2 to 3 times. I've been scared for almost 20 years.
20 years, yep.
And since then, even going back home, friends, relatives, displaced people, I hardly know a lot of people even there to identify me. But here's my question in regards to the deportation of Liberian, some of them that live in college, in regards to their documents.
Okay.
We have civil war, and then many of the people came here for rescue to seek green passes. But because of some document issues, they are unable to go back. To still in this country. And this present government is looking at the situation or deporting them. If there is a vote within the Congress today, what would be your position? And if you do vote yes or no, if, for example, you vote yes, what will be your influence to your fellow congressmen? So like these people who have some biological tie to the United States to stay here, to be able to support themselves, to be able to meet the needs of their family. Because back home right now, they have no real contact. Like that, some of them have been here almost 20 years. How could they be sent back home? So what would be your position in regard?
Yeah, Samuel, thanks for sharing that. Look, I mean, and for those of you who are listening to Samuel and just can appreciate, again, he's been here 20 years. You know, he outlined the history of Liberia, close ally to the United States, ties to America for a long period historically over time. And look, I know a lot of the folks from the Liberian community. I've interacted with them. I've met with them and their families. Many of them are small business owners. Many of them are healthcare workers. They may be taking care of some of your family members in long-term and healthcare facilities, for instance. My position is there needs to be a long-term solution so that the community doesn't have to go through this uncertainty or unpredictability every couple of years. And again, I say that from the perspective of folks who have already been here 20 years, 30 years. This is an easy one in the context of immigration reform. These are folks who are making our community stronger. They're active in the community. They're working. Their kids are now in schools or graduating from schools or in college. So I'm working as hard as I can to one, educate my colleagues on the importance of the Liberian community, and two, I'm working on setting up a meeting with the Liberian community we have in Minnesota with the legislative leaders in Congress and the Speaker of the House, saying, hey, what can we do to bring this to the forefront, to get attention to this, to get a vote on this, to pass a policy that makes sense. We're now starting a new Liberian caucus for those of us that represent communities in the Liberian community. We're starting that, and we'll be launching that, I think it's next week. And so I'm just continuing to do everything I can to stand out and stick out on that, which I think is very, very important. So thanks, Samuel. I appreciate that. We're going to keep rolling on with questions. If you'd like to ask a question, dial *3 on your telephone, and you'll go into a queue, and we'll keep rolling through folks as fast as we can. Okay, we got Joe on the line from Coon Rapids. Thanks for waiting.
Hi. This is Jill from Coon Rapids. I saw a poll today related to the Mueller investigation, and I was just wondering what was the purpose of the poll. It was regarding whether or not, I believe it was via email. People that I know received it via email from.
Oh, yeah, sure. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and it, I'm finding it right now, but I was just wondering, it was about firing Rosenstein. So it was about, I was wondering if you're polling your constituents about firing Mueller and Rosenstein because you would be okay with President Trump doing that as long as it was popular, or what was the purpose of the poll? And
good question. So and the reason I sent that out is that there's been a lot in the news lately with the president wants to fire Mueller, or he wants to have the Justice Department fire Mueller, who's the independent counsel. My view, personally, regardless of how you may check, and I understand people have different opinions, my view is that Mueller should not be fired. He should be allowed to continue and finish his investigation. Again, you may have a different view, and that's fine. I appreciate that. So that was just to get a snapshot of, what folks may think. Do they think that's the right approach or the wrong approach? Personally, I don't think it's the right approach. I'm all for supporting the president's policies when they make sense, economic policy, tax reform, the overhaul, etc. But when I think it's going to be an inhibitor to that process, I'll just speak on. I don't think it's a good idea. So anyway, that's just my view there. Again, we're going to keep rolling with questions. We got Walt from Brooklyn Park. Thanks for waiting.
Yeah. I hope I can stay with you. I think my battery's going dead on my phone.
Speak quick, Walt.
I would want to know what your position is on the Central States Pension Fund. I'm a 40-year Teamster that's about to lose his pension in 2025 when they go broke.
Okay, yep, and let me answer it this way. So for those of you who don't know, what Walt is referring to is a pension fund that has been slowly, essentially going underwater. Central states. I've worked with some local folks in Minnesota that have also been concerned about addressing some pension issues, like auto dealers, for instance. We have a lot of auto dealers that have huge liabilities and want to make sure that if they were able to ever sell their business, pass on their business, or have their employees benefit for, pension promises, et cetera, they'll be there and they won't be underwater. And so what Congress has done in the past is they've done some reforms. One was done a couple of years ago where basically employees and employers had to kick in a little bit more to make sure the system was going to be beneficial or secure for future pension providers. Now with Central States, I think what's going on now is there's a new joint select committee that has been set aside, or it's a little task force group that was appointed by a handful of members in pension background for multi-employer pensions, and they are supposed to come back with a solution or a legislative proposal before the end of the year. And I would expect there's going to be some action on a pension bill of some sort before the end of the year, and that would be to help shore up maybe Central States or some of these other pension plans in exchange for giving some longevity for a longer period of time. And that's going to have to be some sort of a compromise solution that helps people such as yourself make sure they've got some competence in particular to be there for the long term for you, for instance, that you may be able to count on. Okay, we got Dory from Edina. Thanks for waiting, Dory.
Yeah, thanks for taking my call, Congressman. I'm frustrated. I don't like the tax cut that the Congress has passed. Number one, I've heard both Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and others in those tax brackets say, we don't need tax cuts. We should have increased our taxes.
Well, many of them did have their taxes increased, but yeah.
Well, but not the top 2%, not the people that are bazillionaires. And in any event, I didn't get my taxes, in any event, to move on. But the Republicans have always said we've got to decrease the deficit, and yet the deficit is being increased because of these huge tax cuts given to the very, very wealthy. Now, I have a major concern in that I'm hearing that the Republicans now are going to be reducing Medicare benefits and Social Security benefits because they're looking at these entitlements as a way to decrease the deficit. And I'm concerned for people who need help. I think that we're a country that we need to help those who are in need of help. I don't think we should just reward or continue to feed money into the richest and take away from those who need it. And I'm interested in your stand on that. I mean, I think that, and I'm also concerned. I'm not a fan of our president at all. Because I believe that he's trying to make this into the United States of Trump and no longer the United States of America. I'm very, very frightened with him in our presidency. And I guess I'm interested in, maybe you have a response to me in that regard.
Yeah.
But I'm very interested in how we're going to, and why Congress wants to take away Social Security and Medicare benefits.
Okay. Well, thanks, Dory. And I appreciate it. Because first of all, I don't know anybody in Congress that wants to take Social Security and Medicare away. I don't know of any proposals that would actually take them. I don't think there's going to be any legislation introduced that would do that by any means. In fact, if anything, there's going to be bipartisan support to shore up those programs, as there was with Social Security Disability just a couple of years ago, because that was starting to affect the broader Social Security program. And that's no different than what Ronald Reagan did with the Democratic Congress. You've got to do that in a bipartisan way so that Social Security will be safe and secure, so that we can preserve and protect Medicare in particular for those who are counting on it. And the good news is, and I'm authoring and I've authored some other healthcare initiatives, and I've teamed up with some liberal Democrats to making sure we're looking at chronic care and coordinated care, for instance, on not just treating it as sick care, but health care, and doing things different within Medicare for coordinated care. So your primary physician's talking to your specialist, for instance, talking to your pharmacist, et cetera. And Mayo Clinic and all these organizations are strongly supportive of the patient advocacy groups, are strongly supportive of that approach. But on the deficit or tax side, I would just say this. Look, I know a lot of wealthier individuals that are paying more after the tax overhaul, and they're complaining about it. But my answer is, look, this was geared towards again, 90% of everyone in the country got a tax cut. And so, and I don't talk about the tax cut because every individual family is in a different situation. What I talk about are the importance of the broader economic policies that are now bringing jobs back home to the United States. A stronger economy benefits you as someone who relies on these programs. That's really important. And that doesn't mean that we should ignore deficits and debt. And I don't think it's just the $1.5 trillion, the dollar amount that was put as a part of the tax bill. That was sort of these arcane rules that we had to do under the Senate rules that forced us into that position. I think it's more important to look at what's the size of the deficit or the debt in relation to the size of our economy. And that's where we're making improvement in the long term. Because if we did nothing on the tax overhaul, if we hadn't done it, it was going south in a hurry in the future. It wasn't getting better. It was only getting worse. And what we need to do is make it better and then focus on the other side of the ledger, the spending side of the ledger. And most of that comes through healthcare reforms, in particular with better coordinated care, for instance. But it's a really good point. There's a lot of confusion out there about that because there's been sort of talk about, only like the 1% are benefiting, but it's actually not accurate or not true because most of the dollars now that are paid under revenue, there's an increased percentage of wealthier folks that are paying more actually in than before. So again, it depends on your individual situation, of course. Okay, we're going to keep rolling. It looks like we've got Rachel on the line from Edina.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thanks for waiting.
You bet. So I will just tell you, I have grown up and have always been a pretty liberal Democrat. I'm much more centrist now that I'm older, but I have voted for you the last 2 elections. And I'll tell you why. Most specifically, I liked, especially 2 times ago, your very positive campaign strategy when you were not saying anything negative about your opponent. That was impressive. So, I mean, it makes a big deal. Like, it makes a big impact. So, my big question is, I have a 20-year-old in college, and I have a 15-year-old who, at Edina High School, they asked them to do research on whether it's more beneficial to go to college or not to go to college. And he came away with all the research that he did. He did a big research paper that it wouldn't benefit him to go to college. Now, all 4 of my grandparents graduated from college. My grandma was born in 1903, and she graduated with a pharmaceutical degree in 1924. My parents both have doctorate degrees. I have 2 master's degrees. Like, everyone in our family has a lot of education. And it is so difficult for me to try and talk to my son about the importance of college when he comes away saying, all this research says it's going to cost me too much after going to school, and all of the cost of school is so high that I won't be able to pay off my debt for years and years and years and years. What can we do to, I guess, as a community and as a state and as a country, help alleviate some of that fear and thought so that kids feel like they can go to school?
Yeah, well, it's a really good question, and as I mentioned a little bit earlier in the call, thanks, Rachel. What I mentioned a little bit earlier in the call, too, is as I run into employers, small, medium, and large employers in Minnesota, they all talk about how it's really hard for them to find folks to fill a lot of different positions. And these are skilled positions, they're unskilled positions, and in particular, a lot of jobs that are in different trades. I talked to home builders, for instance. They just cannot find people that are working in the trades in carpentry. And many of these classes, again, used to be taught in middle school or high school, for instance, metal shop and wood shop. So I do think we need to reorient some of our college aid programs so that they're also obtainable as financial aid, et cetera, for some of the more technical skills that can get acquired from a 2-year institution, community and technical college. Folks can make jobs paying $85,000 to $100,000 doing advanced certain types of welding, using lasers, for instance, where they do have to be trained, but it does not take a 4-year degree at a liberal college institution, for instance. And so, that's one option. What I also talk about in terms of student loans and debt, and this is sort of, I think, where you talk about this trade-off of the research that your 15-year-old had done. But I think we have to look at other alternative means of financing education because the tuition rates have just gone up exponentially over the years at a high rate, much higher than the level of inflation. And so I've been co-authoring legislation that would provide essentially an equity model where institutions would be providing the student wouldn't be taking out a loan, but a private entity would give money to the student in exchange for a payout once they were able to get a job in the future, and that company would take the risk. I mean, is the student going to be a teacher? Are they going to be a successful small businessman or entrepreneur? And it would be a payback of a certain percentage of their income. And that's a different type of model that I think kind of gets at the heart of the fact that when you've got Pell Grants and financial aid flowing to students, but 50 cents of every dollar is going right to tuition increases, that's a problem. And the same for student loans, where the institutions are building that into the baseline and counting on that resource themselves as opposed to it really directly benefiting the students. And so part of the conversation is, it makes sense to move yourself up the economic ladder, but sometimes you can go to school in a trade school or get an apprenticeship, and once you're employed, keep bettering yourself, get that next degree. Many of many employers that I'm talking to are now using the benefits of the tax overhaul to re-educate and pay for education for their employees, because they want to make sure they stay skilled and are filling in sort of the next level of position, where they're going to need jobs the next couple of years. That's also another benefit of tax reform that we're seeing. Some of our Minnesota companies have been doing that. And I was up in Champlin, for instance, recently, and even the daycare centers up there were now using the tax benefits to pay for education for their employees for early childhood family education programs, so they could be trained for the long term to stay in those fields, which is one example. So, I didn't totally answer your question, but tried to get it, I guess, in a little circuitous route. But thanks for the thought on higher ed. Okay, we're going to keep rolling. We got Linda on the line from Edina. Thanks for waiting.
Hi, Congressman. I'm wondering if you could define the sort of nebulous terms of the deep state, the Washington elite, and then finally, what is your overall impression of the current administration?
Well, you should tell me what your impression is.
Well, I know what my impression is, and I would very much like to hear yours.
Well, I mean, this is the way I look at it. Look, I mean, I will say this, is that one, over the years, you've had a lot of different agencies that have imposed a lot of regulations. It's been very harmful to the economy, for instance. One thing I will say positive about this administration, they have now pulled back on a lot of that regulatory environment, and I hear that from our employers all the time. They got a lot more freedom with certainty and predictability to do investments in certain areas where they were never able to do before, and they were restricted. It's one of the reasons why we absolutely now do see energy development at such an exponential rate in the United States. Where now, I think within the next year, we're going to be like the #1 producer of oil in the world. I mean, who would have thought that would ever be, we would be in that position, and where we're, being able to do that now through technology and innovation, which is pretty amazing. And so we don't have to rely on Saudi Arabia, for instance. That's no longer the case. And then, look, I mean, if I disagree with the administration on a number of other different areas. For instance, take the boundary waters, take up in northern Minnesota and mining and mineral leases. I just think, knowing full well, and I grew up in Minnesota, that's Minnesota's Yellowstone up there from my perspective, and doing copper sulfide mining in that area without science that backs allowing you to be able to go forward, I think is wrong. And I'll speak out on that whenever I have the opportunity to do that. And that's why I voted that way, and that's why I've been speaking out against the administration on some of their policies around the mineral and lease extensions that they've been doing up there, because I think it potentially puts a very significant threat on our waters in northern Minnesota, as an example. And I'm also concerned about the direction that the administration has gone on trade, because I think with all the benefits we have with the economy going on right now, we also need to sell American. It's good, sell American goods, sell American services, and get that out, and then get the money back to the United States, which we're seeing with the more competitive tax code. So I'm not a supporter of some of the tariffs that have been implemented, because I think they could backfire in a hurry. And for instance, some of our medical device companies now have been targeted by other countries, including our allies, that are targeting us with their own tariffs, which are taxes that we'll all pay more for, and that harms a lot of manufacturing jobs, which I worry about. So that's just sort of my perspective. Speak out when you think they're wrong, and then stick up for them when you think they're right. But that's no different than every past administration that I've worked with. And if you want to get something done as a legislator, you just got to work hard and try and get stuff across the finish line, and again, try and build those relationships across the aisle, because then you will make progress. Absolutely. Okay, we got time for Tara here from Coon Rapids. Thanks for waiting.
Hi, thank you for taking my call.
Yeah.
One of my questions, my sister passed away 7 years ago from a prescription overdose.
Okay.
And thank you. And I did actually call the clinic twice, and then even wrote a letter finally to the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice. And he was on a conditional license for 2 years, and then finally lost it in Minnesota. But what my problem is he had already actually lost it in North Dakota due to somebody passing away.
Oh.
So how are we holding those doctors accountable?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting point, and I wasn't trying to necessarily get at that question in the survey that I did in terms of limiting what doctors can prescribe, but I will tell you it is very easy for doctors just to prescribe pills, and that's one of the reasons why I've got the bill for Medicare Part D, or those seniors that are going into that program with drug pharmaceuticals, that they actually are educated on different options and have as much information as possible. And there are discussions about holding I suppose physicians accountable in the sense of what they can actually release or are authorized to prescribe, and then you can actually have a trail to follow up on of why was there another prescription that was given. For instance, we did a National Drug Take Back Day just a few weekends ago, and this is where they say now that 70% of all the pills that young people obtain come from the medicine cabinet, and it's because of these pills that are sitting in your medicine cabinet. They expired years ago, but people don't dispose of them properly. They don't throw them away, and you shouldn't just flush them down the toilet. They go into the water supply, but you can dispose of them properly at receptacles that exist with the Hennepin County Sheriffs and different organizations at your police department, etc. They'll dispose of them, but that's where all the young people are getting these pills, and then they become addicted, and they end up finding their trail into heroin or other really cheap drugs that come in from Mexico right now, which is a big problem. I think the president's been right to target some of those drug channels that have gone through Mexico in terms of having a secure border. So that has actually been a real problem along those lines. So I'm going to look into a little bit more about what other, you talked about the conditional license. We had a HCMC doctor come and give a little roundtable or testimony to some of the members on my committee in talking about, hey, I'm a physician, I'm trying to work and educate my other colleagues who are physicians about other alternatives other than just giving prescriptions. And it is a problem. And some folks in the roundtable that I've talked to, they were expressing their I want to say frustration or experience of physicians who had definitely been overprescribing or were essentially secretly being able to have their number accessed through the phone book, and people were showing up at an apartment at a strange address. And clearly these individuals were making money through these sales, probably not legally, or what is close to borderline legal, but probably should be illegal. So good point there. Look, we're going to have to wrap up because we have to do it in an hour. But don't hang up if you're on the phone, because if we didn't get to your question, you go into a voicemail, and then either myself or someone on my staff, we get back to you within the next 24 hours or day and a half. Just give us some time, and we'll be able to answer your question. And I just can't thank you enough for joining tonight. I can't thank you for the variety of feedback we had. We talked about taxes, we talked about opioids, we didn't talk about foreign policy, but we talked about some immigration issues and a good variety, gun violence, a good variety of issues as I hear about on a regular basis. I hold open office hours when I'm at home. I think being accessible is very important to being effective. I want to thank you for your advice, your input, and the time I spend both in different settings back home, whether it's visiting companies or these roundtables, has definitely helped and bringing forth some more solutions in some of these issues as well. Don't hang up. You'll go into a voicemail. We'll get back to you the next day or day and a half. Thank you for the privilege of representing you. Have a great evening, and we will continue to be in touch, and have a good night.
The Access Live event has ended.
Thank you again for participating in my telephone town hall meeting. I'm sorry I was unable to get to everyone's question, but please feel free to leave my staff a voicemail with any questions, comments, or concerns from the call. This is an emergency. You can contact my district office at 952-405-8510. We'll be sure to get right back in touch with you. Thanks again. It's an honor serving you in Congress.
If you wish to leave a message, please press 1. Otherwise, you may simply hang up.